I had imagined moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would finally give me peace. For years, I had lived in cramped apartments with thin walls, constant arguments from neighbors, and the nonstop noise of city traffic. My whole life felt loud, chaotic. So when I finally saved enough to buy my first home, it felt like winning a personal war. I drove up the street on that warm afternoon with goosebumps on my arms, the smell of fresh pavement in the air, and the feeling that something good was finally beginning. And the house was perfect, small, neat, with a clean porch and a freshly painted fence. The neighborhood looked quiet and well-kept. Kids rode bicycles. Dogs napped lazily under trees. A couple of neighbors waved politely. Everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. But peace has a strange way of disappearing quietly. Sometimes it doesn't slam the door, it slips away like a whisper. And on my second day, there was a knock at the door. A man stood outside, tall, thin, with neatly combed hair and an unsettling smile. His name was Eric. He introduced himself as the street organizer, which sounded like a fancy title for someone who took neighborhood rules too seriously. And without even stepping inside, he pointed at a ceramic pot near my window. "And we don't allow ceramics in the front yard," he said flatly. And I blinked. "Oh, I didn't know, I'll remove it." And he nodded slowly like a teacher approving a student, then walked away. And I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off. But the next morning, I woke up to a bright orange notice on my door, and violation, unapproved decorative items. And the pot was already gone, and I sighed and threw the paper away. But then another notice came the next day, and warning, trash bin visible from street. And except my trash bin was inside the property line, and then another, and noise complaint at 11:27 p.m. And I had been asleep by 10, and within a week I had received 7 notices. Every morning I stepped outside expecting one, and at first I thought it was just HOA strictness. Maybe they were particular, maybe I was overthinking. But then I saw Eric again. He stood across the street, whispering to another neighbor while pointing at my house. And I waved, he didn't wave back, he just smirked, and a feeling like ice water slid down my back. And on the 7th day, I received a formal letter and final warning, mandatory property inspection scheduled. And final warning and final, and I had barely moved in. And that evening, the elderly couple across the street, the Harpers, waved me over. Mrs. Harper looked worried, her hands shaking slightly as she poured me tea. "And they're targeting you," she said quietly, and I frowned. "Who?" "And Eric and the people he controls, they run this street through fear." And Mr. Harper added, "A family tried to fight back last year, they left within months." And my stomach tightened. "And why?" I asked. "And for control," he said. "For power, they push out anyone who doesn't obey." And the word obey made my skin crawl, and that night I stayed awake out of paranoia. Around 12:45 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my window. I peeked out and froze. 2 people were in my yard, and one of them was unmistakably Eric. And he pointed a flashlight at my plants, my porch steps, my wall. The other man wrote things on a clipboard. They walked slowly, strategically, like they were searching for violations or planting them. And I grabbed my phone and recorded everything. And the next morning, a massive violation notice appeared. And severe violation, structural modification without approval. And structural modification. And I hadn't touched anything. This wasn't an inspection. And this was an attack, and I decided to confront the HOA. I marched to their office, but the secretary didn't even look up. "And they're in a meeting," she said, "and when can I speak to them? And they don't take appointments. And this is urgent. And send an email." And I already did. And then send another. And her tone was robotic and cold, like she was trained to dismiss anyone questioning the system. And outside, the sun felt hotter, the air heavier. I walked home feeling a kind of fear I hadn't felt in years, a fear of being trapped, of being outnumbered. But this time, fear grew into something else, anger. And when I got home, I checked the camera footage from the previous night. It was worse than I thought, and Eric wasn't just inspecting, and he was planting evidence. And in one clip, he placed a cracked piece of pipe under my porch. And in another, he pointed at my siding and whispered, "Good enough." And the next morning, another violation came, and major hazard, eviction under review, and eviction, and they wanted me gone, and I felt something snap inside me, and I stormed to the Harper's house again. Mrs. Harper opened the door with worry on her face. "And they're accelerating," she whispered. And I showed her the footage, and she gasped and steadied herself on the counter. "And this is exactly what they did to the Martins." "And who are the Martins?" I asked. "And a family who moved in last year. They received fake violations until they gave up and moved out." "And did they complain?" I asked. and they tried. But Eric has friends on the old HOA board. They manipulate paperwork, signatures, fines, and Mr. Harper returned from the living room holding a dusty folder, the one that would change everything. And this, he said, is what I kept, proof that they've done this before. And inside were old HOA letters and complaints supposedly filed by neighbors and handwriting that looked suspiciously like Eric's and fines that didn't match official guidelines and photos showing items that weren't real issues and signatures that didn't match neighbors' handwriting and a list of forced property inspections, and it wasn't sloppy paperwork. And it was a pattern and a system and an organized attack. And they pick someone, Mr. Harper said, and they destroy them. And I clenched the folder tightly. And not this time, I whispered. And for the next 2 days, I gathered everything. And every notice I received and emails and printed texts and camera footage and audio recordings and interviews with neighbors and statements from those who refused to sign complaints and documents from the Harpers and photos of planted evidence and my dining table became a war room. And the more I dug, the darker things became. Eric wasn't just a controlling neighbor. He was part of a small group who manipulated the HOA from the inside. They created fake violations, submitted false complaints, altered maintenance records, and targeted anyone who wasn't in their circle. And they got away with it because people were afraid. But fear doesn't scare someone who finally decides they're done being pushed. And the next HOA general meeting was scheduled for Friday, and 3 days away. And I spent those 3 days preparing like my home, and my dignity depended on it. And the morning of the meeting, I woke up early. The sun wasn't even fully rising yet, but I could feel its heat through the blinds. My stomach twisted with a mix of anxiety and adrenaline. And I dressed in a simple outfit, tied my hair back, gathered my folder and USB drive, and stepped outside. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid of who might be watching me, and I was ready. And because I wasn't just walking into a meeting, and I was walking into a battlefield. And this time, and I wasn't the one being hunted. And I was the one bringing the truth. And the evening of the HOA meeting was heavier than any storm I had ever witnessed. The sky was cloudless, yet the air felt thick, tense, electrified. I walked toward the community hall with my evidence folder held tightly under my arm. My heart wasn't racing, it was marching. Steady, determined, ready, and the street felt different. People peeked from windows, some whispered, some watched openly, some avoided my eyes, but something had shifted. Those who once stayed silent now sensed that the truth was about to surface, and they wanted to see it unfold. And when I stepped into the hall, the first thing I noticed was the crowd. Rows of chairs filled, not like normal meetings where only a handful showed up. Tonight, almost the entire neighborhood was present, and on the stage sat the HOA board, President Dalton, Treasurer Marcus, and of course, Eric. He sat there confidently, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed like a king sitting before his kingdom. He didn't look threatened. He didn't look afraid. He looked amused, and as if he was watching a show, and he had no idea the show was his fall. And I took a seat near the front. Immediately, whispers began behind me, and that's her. And she's the one they're targeting, and I heard she has evidence. And finally, someone's standing up to them. And the board shuffled papers, trying to appear busy. The president tapped his microphone, and let us begin tonight's HOA meeting. First order of business, and I stood up. And I have a complaint that must be addressed immediately. And people turned, heads twisted, heartbeats paused. And President Dalton frowned. You are disrupting the— And no, I said clearly, I am exposing. And the room gasped, and Dalton stiffened. Sit down. And I will not sit down, I said, because this is not a personal issue anymore. This is a community-wide problem. I have evidence of harassment, forged violations, illegal trespassing, planted evidence, and financial manipulation. And enough, Dalton shouted. But it was too late. And truth doesn't ask permission. And truth demands space. And I walked to the front, placed my thick folder on the table, and connected my USB to the projector. And since you won't let me speak, I said calmly, I'll let the facts speak. And with a click, the screen lit up. And the first video appeared, and Eric and a man sneaking around my house at 1:13 a.m., and flashlights, whispering, writing something down, and gasps echoed through the room. And then the next video, and Eric planting the broken pipe by my porch. And a woman across the room covered her mouth. And someone whispered, oh my God, and another said, I knew it. And Eric suddenly lunged out of his chair. And this is private property, you can't. And it's my property, I snapped. And I can record anyone illegally trespassing on it. and the hall erupted in brief applause, and the next slide appeared, and a forged complaint sheet claiming Mrs. Harper reported me for yard disorder. And Mrs. Harper jumped to her feet in anger. And that is not my signature. And then the next forged complaint, and then the next, and then the next, and dozens of signatures, none belonging to the people written on the forms, and residents began shouting, and you forged our names, and you lied about us, and you used us as excuses, and Dalton pounded the table. She is manipulating, and I cut him off, and let's talk about manipulation. And I clicked to the next slide. And a scanned copy of HOA fee records, and showing unexplained charges, missing funds, and inflated fines. And gasps filled the air like cracks of lightning, and I held up the pages. And these fines do not match HOA rules. These fees were never approved by the community. Over $18,000 of homeowner money is unaccounted for under your leadership. And Dalton's face flushed red, and Marcus, the treasurer, began sweating visibly. And I continued. And not only financial fraud, but targeted harassment. And I played an audio clip, and Eric's voice from behind my fence, and just one more violation and she'll be gone. And the room fell silent, and not a breath, and not a shuffle, and not a cough, and just silence. And then an explosive eruption, and you threatened her, and you tried to force her out, and you did this to us too. And how many families did you push out? And the board panicked. Dalton tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Marcus grabbed papers, dropping them in desperation. And Eric, however, didn't break, and he sneered. And this neighborhood needs order, he said. People like her, and people like me. I shouted so loudly that the microphone screeched, and I walked toward him, staring directly into his eyes. And you mean people who don't bow to your control, people who don't let you bully them, people who won't obey your fake rules and fraud schemes. And he clenched his jaw. And you think you've won, he whispered. And I think the truth has, I replied. And I clicked again. And the screen displayed a full timeline of every violation I had received, and compared with security footage showing none of those violations existed. And people were furious. And one man stood up from the back row. And you fined me $600 for a grass hazard that wasn't real. And a woman shouted, and you told me the neighbors complained about me, but they never did. And another yelled, and you made us afraid in our own homes. And the hall erupted into chaos and rising voices, anger, betrayal, and a woman burst into tears. We thought we were the problem, and a father shouted, and you destroyed families to control property. And Dalton banged his fist. And order, order. And no, I said, and you don't get to ask for order now. And the final slide appeared, and a list of every homeowner forced to sell their house in the last 4 years. And next to each name and the same signature approving the eviction, Eric, and the crowd gasped collectively, and I stepped back. And this is your order. And a neighborhood ruled by fear, lies, and greed, but it ends today. And the room exploded into chants, and vote them out, and vote them out, and vote them out. And Dalton tried to escape. But dozens blocked the aisle. The treasurer dropped to a chair, holding his head. Eric stepped backward, his facade cracking for the first time. And an elderly man stood and spoke with a trembling voice, and we demand an immediate vote for removal. And hands raised all around, and almost unanimous, and all 3 board members were officially removed. But that wasn't the end. And residents surrounded the table, flipping through documents, pointing at evidence, shouting questions, demanding accountability. And then someone called the police, and within minutes 2 officers arrived. After reviewing the videos and documents, they escorted Dalton, Marcus, and Eric outside for questioning, and the hall erupted in celebration, and cheers, and tears, and people hugging each other, and people thanking me, and people apologizing for staying silent for so long, and Mrs. Harper hugged me tightly. And you did what no one else dared to do. And a man approached me with glassy eyes. And my wife and I left last year because of them. Thank you for stopping this. And another whispered, and you saved us. And I stepped outside into the cool night, and the sky seemed clearer, and the street felt lighter, and for the first time since moving in, and I felt like I belonged. But something inside me whispered that this fight wasn't completely over. And that whisper became louder, and when I saw a black car parked across the street, an engine running and windows tinted. Facing my house, and watching, and waiting, and not moving, and I froze, and something darker had just begun. And the night of the HOA collapse was supposed to bring peace, closure, an end to the war I never wanted to fight. As the corrupt board members were escorted out under flashing police lights, I believed justice had finally secured its place in the neighborhood. People hugged. Tears flowed. Whispers filled the hall saying I had saved the street. But as I walked home that night, the victory felt. incomplete, and because the war hadn't ended, and it had only shifted, and the enemy hiding behind the curtain was far larger than anyone in that hall imagined, and the dark car parked across from my house didn't move. The engine hummed low, a predator waiting. I stood still for a few moments, watching the tinted windows, hoping the shape inside would reveal itself, and it didn't. And instead, after an unbearable 30 seconds, the car silently rolled forward, turned at the corner, and disappeared into the night. And I breathed out, but my body stayed tense. My instincts screamed that someone out there wasn't finished with me. And the next morning, the new HOA board, temporarily appointed, came to speak with me. 3 neighbors I trusted now sat in control. They brought me updates, and police had taken Dalton, Marcus, and Eric for questioning. And investigations were underway into missing HOA funds, and a court order might soon freeze Eric's personal accounts. But even as they spoke, I saw something in their eyes: fear. And it wasn't fear of the old HOA board. It was fear of something bigger, and Mrs. Harper visited later with a worried look. "And come with me," she said softly, and I followed her across the street. Inside her living room, she handed me a brown envelope. "And you need to see this," she whispered. And inside were printed pages, email screenshots, property transaction records, deed transfers, anonymous payments, and transactions repeated one phrase, and Cornerstone Acquisitions LLC. "And who are they?" I asked, and Mrs. Harper swallowed hard. "And that's the part no one ever talks about." And her husband joined us. "And they're not a normal company, they buy neighborhoods. And neighborhoods. And yes, entire ones, street by street, house by house. They take over HOAs, force out residents, then buy their homes at lowered values. And they were using Eric," I whispered, and Mr. Harper nodded slowly. "And he wasn't working alone, he was working for them." And then Mrs. Harper said something that sent chills through my bones. "And they've been watching the neighborhood ever since you exposed him." And my mind replayed the dark car, the note, the footsteps in the night, and they weren't just angry, and they were threatened. And because I had destroyed their plan. And over the next few days, unusual things started happening, and a drone flew low over my property, and unknown numbers called repeatedly but hung up when I answered. And emails from the HOA server showed login attempts from out of state, and a note appeared on my porch: "And stop digging, stop talking, walk away," and no signature, and no explanation. But messages don't need signatures when you already know who they're from, and Cornerstone. And the shadows behind everything. And one evening, while reviewing the old HOA financial records, I noticed something odd: and deposits made in the HOA name but withdrawn within hours, and large ones. And every withdrawal was signed with a name I didn't recognize, and J.L. Peterson. And I searched public records, and nothing. And I searched business listings, and nothing. And then I checked property management databases, and the name appeared listed under Cornerstone Acquisitions. And they weren't just trying to buy the neighborhood. And they already owned pieces of it, and several properties, and 2 rental homes, and according to the files, and my house was marked, "Target, Acquisition Priority 1. And my skin crawled. And they had wanted my home all along. And not because they disliked me, and not because of Eric, and not because of HOA rules, but because my house sat in a strategic location, on the corner of the street where they planned their redevelopment. And my presence was an obstacle, and they needed me gone, and Eric had been their weapon. And the next night, I couldn't sleep. My living room felt too quiet. My windows felt too open. At 2:13 a.m., I heard something paper sliding under the door, and my heart pounded as I approached it, and a note: "And last warning, we need that property." And I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The air was sharp, the street dead silent. A car engine hummed somewhere far off. And across the street, just beyond the streetlight, a figure stood watching me, and tall, still, like a statue. And when I raised the flashlight, the figure stepped back into the darkness. And I moved inside quickly and locked the door, and this wasn't over. And I wasn't intimidated. And I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the street was empty. No witnesses, no footprints, no car plates. And the officer told me calmly, "And whoever it is, they know what they're doing." And that terrified me more than the note. And the next morning, I met with the new HOA board. They agreed Cornerstone's involvement had to be investigated. But I decided something else, and I wouldn't wait for authorities. And I was going after Cornerstone myself. And I spent the next 3 days doing nonstop research, and digging through public records, and tracking property transfers, and mapping ownership patterns, and reading old town council meeting minutes, and analyzing acquisition patterns, and a horrible picture formed. And Cornerstone had been quietly buying homes through force, and pushing out families, and lowering property values intentionally, and installing their people into HOA boards, and creating artificial violations to pressure residents, and then buying their homes at 60–70% value. And it wasn't an HOA problem, and it was a syndicate, and a group operating like a legal mafia. And the person leading their acquisitions for our neighborhood was someone named Jonas J.L. Peterson. And he wasn't a ghost anymore, and I had found him, and I looked up every traceable detail. Then I assembled a file thicker than the one I used against Eric. But the moment I finished, I heard a knock at my door, and 3 slow knocks, and I froze, and peeking through the peephole I saw nothing. The porch was empty, but another note lay on the ground, and now you've gone too far. And anger surged through me like fire, and they wanted a war, and fine, and I wasn't afraid of shadows anymore. And the next HOA meeting was crowded again. People knew something bigger was happening. I stood at the front with my new evidence folder. And this, I said, placing it on the table, isn't about Eric anymore. It's about a company using us like chess pieces. And I projected maps, documents, emails, purchase records, and people watched in shock, some even gasping. And these forced violations, and these sudden evictions, and the families who vanished without a fight, and these weren't coincidences, and they were part of a strategic plan. And Mrs. Harper stood, and they did this to us too. And others nodded, and some cried. And a man shouted, "My brother moved away because of them." And I showed the notes I received, and the drone footage, and the late-night visits, and the threats. And then I placed Jonas Peterson's name on the screen, and this is the man behind everything. And people murmured. And this, I said, clicking to the next slide, is his criminal history. And gasps filled the hall, and Jonas had been investigated twice, once for property fraud, once for intimidation, and walked free both times. And he wasn't a random agent, and he was a professional predator. And a woman in the back stood, tears slipping down her face. And my sister sold her home to Cornerstone last year after they threatened her kids. And the room erupted, and voices rose, and they can't control us anymore. And we want legal action, and expose them publicly, and protect our homes. And I raised my hand to quiet everyone. And we can fight this, and together. But we need to stand united, or they will isolate us one by one. And the board agreed immediately, and a neighborhood petition was created, and residents signed to launch a lawsuit, and a local journalist contacted me, and a community lawyer offered help, and Cornerstone's plan crumbled within days, and they sent one last letter, cold, threatening, and you don't know what you've started. But they were wrong, and I knew exactly what I had started, and a movement, and a resistance, and a line that would not be crossed again. And a month later, the case against Cornerstone was official, and neighborhood coercion, financial manipulation, fraudulent acquisition, and organized property harassment. And the town council launched a full investigation. And the attorney general requested records. And Cornerstone's local office shut down overnight. And Jonas disappeared for a while, but was eventually arrested in another city for related charges. And the neighborhood held a block party the day the news broke. And people laughed, and children played. And voices were loud again, not fearful but joyful. And Mrs. Harper gave me a hug so tight I felt my ribs shift. "And you saved this street," she whispered. "And you gave us back our home." And I looked around. And for the first time, the neighborhood didn't feel like a battlefield. And it felt like a community. And a community that almost fell apart but didn't. And because someone stood up. And because someone refused to be silent. And because someone exposed the truth. And they tried to ruin my life. And they tried to push me out. And they tried to intimidate me. But in the end, they pushed me into becoming the one thing they feared the most, and a voice that wouldn't break. And in that voice, it saved an entire neighborhood. And